Dr. Maya Robinson had always believed that success was a journey, not a destination. Sitting in the back seat of the black town car heading toward Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, she thought about how far she had come. Just 5 years ago, she was working late nights in a tiny studio apartment, coding for clients just to pay her bills. Today, she was the CEO of one of the fastest growing tech startups in the country. This trip to New York was important, maybe the most important one of her career. She had been invited to pitch her company to a group of major investors, and if things went well, it could secure the funding that would take her business global. She checked her phone one more time, scrolling through her notes, rehearsing the key points in her head. Every slide of her presentation told the story of years of hard work, sleepless nights, and relentless determination. When the car pulled up to the departure terminal, Maya stepped out with quiet confidence. Her tailored navy suit was simple but elegant, paired with modest heels and a sleek laptop bag slung over her shoulder. As she walked into the terminal, she could feel the usual pre-flight rush: travelers dragging suitcases, kids tugging on parents' hands, flight attendants briskly moving toward their gates. It was chaotic, but Maya thrived on focus. She had checked in online the night before, so she headed straight for security. Her boarding pass read C2A First Class. It wasn't just about comfort. For Maya, sitting in first class symbolized something deeper. Every long night, every no she'd heard before finally getting a yes, every moment she'd doubted herself but kept going anyway. It was a quiet reminder that she had earned this. As she passed through the security checkpoint, Maya noticed the way a few people glanced at her. Her calm, professional demeanor seemed to command attention. She wasn't one to flaunt her success, but there was something about her presence that told the story of someone who had worked hard to get where she was. Walking toward the gate, she allowed herself a rare moment to breathe. Her company had grown from a 2-person idea to a team of 50 innovators. She thought about her employees, her mentors, and even her parents, who had sacrificed so much to support her dreams. She whispered to herself, "This is for all of us." When boarding was announced, Maya lined up with the other first-class passengers. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and jet fuel. The soft hum of conversation filled the space. She smiled politely at a couple nearby discussing their vacation plans and then stepped forward when it was her turn. "Good morning, Dr. Robinson," the gate agent said, scanning her ticket. "Good morning," Maya replied warmly, appreciating that the agent had noticed her title. It wasn't about ego, it was about recognition. Every degree she'd earned, every certification, every late-night study session had led her here. As she entered the jet bridge, a wave of cool, recycled air washed over her. The sound of engines humming in the distance reminded her of all the trips she'd taken over the years, some for business, others for opportunities that had seemed impossible at the time. Each flight had been a step toward this moment. Stepping into the cabin, Maya glanced around at the sleek interior. Plush leather seats, soft lighting, and the faint scent of fresh linen greeted her. A smiling flight attendant directed her toward the front. She walked down the aisle, her heels tapping softly on the carpet, until she reached C2A. Placing her bag carefully in the overhead compartment, Maya settled into her seat. The cushions were firm yet comfortable, and she could already imagine herself sipping coffee while reviewing her notes one last time before landing. She took out her tablet, powered it on, and scrolled through her slides again. She could feel a soft buzz of excitement building inside her. This wasn't just another business meeting, it was a chance to take her company and her vision to the next level. Investors loved innovation, and she had spent months perfecting her pitch to make sure it stood out. Looking out the small oval window, she watched as ground crew members moved briskly beneath the aircraft, preparing for takeoff. The morning sun peeked through scattered clouds, bathing the tarmac in a soft golden light. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply enjoy it, the calm before the whirlwind of meetings and presentations that awaited her in New York. But beneath her calm exterior, Maya carried the weight of responsibility. She thought of her employees' families, of the interns she mentored, and of the young women of color who looked up to her as a role model. She remembered speaking at a recent tech conference where a college student had approached her afterward with tears in her eyes, saying, "Seeing you up there made me believe I could do this too." That moment had stayed with Maya. She wasn't just running a company, she was quietly helping pave the way for others. The cabin began to fill with passengers. A few nodded politely as they passed by, and Maya returned their smiles. The flight attendant offered her a glass of water, which she accepted with gratitude. She glanced at her watch, 30 minutes until takeoff. She wanted to run through her pitch one more time, just to make sure every number, every chart, every word was perfect. She opened her laptop and began typing, the soft clicking of the keyboard blending into the muffled sounds around her. Somewhere deep inside, she felt a sense of anticipation. She didn't know why, but something about this flight felt different. Maybe it was just the importance of the day ahead, or maybe it was intuition whispering quietly, preparing her for what was coming. For now, though, she was focused, grounded, and ready. This was her moment, the calm before the storm she didn't yet see approaching. Maya was scrolling through the last few slides of her pitch when she felt a presence near her seat. At first, she didn't look up. She assumed it was another passenger settling in or a flight attendant preparing the cabin. But then, a deep voice broke her concentration. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone clipped, "I believe you're sitting in my seat." Maya looked up, blinking away the numbers on her tablet screen. A tall, middle-aged man stood in the aisle, holding his boarding pass in one hand and a small carry-on in the other. His expression was polite but firm, as though he was stating a simple fact. She gave him a calm smile and said, "I don't think so. This is seat 2A. She gestured lightly toward the placard above the seat number. "That's what's on my boarding pass." The man frowned slightly, glancing at the small sign, and then back at her. "I'm pretty sure this is mine," he said, holding out his ticket as if expecting her to move without question. Maya took a steady breath, keeping her tone warm and composed. "I understand, but I've already double-checked. My boarding pass says 2A as well." She tapped on the corner of her tablet screen, where she had saved her digital ticket. The man hesitated for a moment, then glanced at his ticket again. Still, he didn't move away. "Well," he said slowly, "maybe they made a mistake. I've been upgraded to first class on this flight, and this is where they told me to sit." Something about his assumption, the quiet confidence that the seat must be his, made Maya's shoulders tighten slightly. She reminded herself to stay calm. Mistakes happen all the time when it comes to seat assignments. She decided to handle this the simplest way possible. "Why don't we ask the flight attendant to check?" she suggested gently, closing her tablet and setting it on her lap. Before the man could respond, a flight attendant walked down the aisle, her perfectly tied scarf swaying slightly with each step. She noticed the man standing in the aisle and approached with a polite smile. "Is everything okay here?" she asked. "Yes," Maya said before the man could speak. "It seems we both have 2A on our boarding passes. Could you please double-check in the system?" The man turned slightly toward the attendant and said, "I was told this is my seat. I've flown this route for years, and I always sit up front." The attendant nodded thoughtfully, taking both their tickets. She scanned them with a handheld device, her expression neutral but focused. After a moment, she looked up. "Dr. Robinson," she said, addressing Maya by name, "you are indeed assigned to seat 2A. Then, turning to the man, she added gently, "Sir, your seat is actually 3C, just behind first class, in the extra comfort section." For a moment, there was silence. Maya expected the man to nod, apologize, and move on, but he didn't. He stared at the flight attendant as though she had made some mistake. "No," he said slowly, shaking his head. "I was told I had first class. I even asked the agent at the counter." They said it was upgraded. The attendant smiled politely but didn't waver. I understand, sir, but according to the system, 3C is your seat for today's flight. Maya thought the issue was resolved. She picked up her tablet, ready to return to her work. But the man still didn't move. Instead, he shifted slightly, placing one hand on the back of the seat in front of her. I really think you should just let me have this one, he said, his voice low but insistent. I'm sure we can sort it out later. Maya blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. She had paid full price for the seat, booked it weeks in advance precisely because she needed the space to prepare for her meeting. She offered a calm but firm reply. I'm sorry, she said softly, but I booked the seat ahead of time for work purposes. It's important I stay here. The man's jaw tightened, and his voice grew slightly sharper. This is ridiculous, he muttered, glancing around the cabin as though expecting others to back him up. A few passengers nearby glanced up from their magazines and tablets, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. The attendant stepped forward again, keeping her voice level. Sir, we do need to ask you to take your assigned seat so that we can complete boarding. If you'd like, I can speak with the gate agent after we take off to see if there's any other option. Still, the man hesitated. He looked at Maya again, his expression unreadable. The cabin around them seemed unusually quiet now. Conversations had lowered, and curious eyes peeked over seat backs. Maya felt the weight of those stares but kept her posture straight, her voice calm. I understand your frustration, she said gently, but this is the seat I purchased. I'm afraid I can't give it up. The man finally stepped back, though his movements were slow, reluctant. He muttered something under his breath too soft for her to catch and walked toward the next row. Maya exhaled quietly, thinking it was finally over. But she could still feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. A few passengers offered her sympathetic smiles, as though silently saying they understood. She returned a polite nod but quickly lowered her gaze, wanting to move on from the moment. Yet something inside her stirred. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about the unspoken assumption that she didn't belong there, that her presence in first class somehow required explanation. She pushed the thought away for now, reminding herself to focus on her meeting ahead. The flight attendant returned, offering Maya a reassuring smile. I apologize for the confusion, she said softly. Please let us know if you need anything before takeoff. Thank you, Maya replied warmly. She leaned back into her seat, trying to find her earlier calm. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this small moment, this seemingly simple misunderstanding, had set something larger into motion. The hum of the engines deepened as more passengers boarded. Maya took a sip of water, scrolling back through her slides. She reminded herself of her purpose, the meeting, the investors, the opportunity. That was what mattered. But somewhere deep in the cabin, a quiet tension still lingered, unspoken, invisible, but real. And though Maya didn't yet realize it, this was only the beginning of a day that would test her patience, her strength, and her composure in ways she never expected. The soft hum of the aircraft's air conditioning filled the cabin as Maya adjusted herself in her seat, trying to shake off the brief tension from earlier. She hoped the misunderstanding about the seat had ended, and now everyone could settle in for the flight. She put her tablet back on the tray table and tried to focus on her presentation. But just as she opened the file again, a faint sound caught her attention, a sharp sigh from the row behind her. She hesitated for a second, then decided to ignore it. It wasn't unusual for people to be frustrated during boarding, after all, flights were often stressful. A few minutes later, the same man who had argued over the seat leaned slightly forward, his voice low but clear enough for her to hear. You know, he said softly, almost conversationally, I still don't understand how there was such a mix-up. Maya paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, then turned her head slightly. His expression was neutral, but there was something in his tone she couldn't quite place, a mix of curiosity and quiet insistence. "It happens sometimes," she replied calmly, keeping her voice polite. "I booked the seat a while ago, so maybe the system didn't update properly on your end." He gave a small nod but didn't seem fully satisfied. "Yeah, maybe," he murmured before leaning back in his seat again. Maya let out a slow breath and returned to her work, determined not to let the distraction get to her. But she couldn't help noticing that the man occasionally shifted in his seat, glancing toward her row more than once. The passengers around them seemed to pick up on the subtle tension too. A woman seated across the aisle glanced between them more than once, her brows faintly furrowed, as though sensing an undercurrent in the air. The cabin crew continued preparing for takeoff, moving gracefully between aisles, checking overhead bins, and offering smiles to passengers. Maya appreciated their calmness, it brought a sense of order to the quiet unease she felt. She closed her tablet and reached for the glass of water the attendant had given her earlier. Taking a slow sip, she tried to center herself. She reminded herself of why she was on this flight: the investor meeting, the future of her company, the opportunity waiting on the other side. But it wasn't just her nerves about the pitch anymore. She felt a subtle weight pressing against her calm exterior, as though the situation wasn't quite over. A few minutes later, as the last passengers boarded, another flight attendant approached Maya's row with a warm smile. "Dr. Robinson, would you like something to drink before we take off? Coffee? Juice? Just water is fine, thank you," Maya replied, returning the smile. As the attendant walked away, she caught a quiet whisper from the row behind her. The man was speaking to another passenger. "I don't get it," he said softly but audibly enough for those nearby to hear. "I fly this route every month. First time I don't get my usual seat." There was no hostility in his words, but the subtle persistence kept drawing attention from other passengers. Maya noticed a few people exchange curious glances, but no one said anything. Maya stayed composed. Years of running a company had taught her how to keep her emotions steady, even when situations felt unfair. She sat up straighter, opened her laptop again, and tuned out the background murmurs. But the quiet energy inside the cabin was shifting. It was subtle, almost invisible, but she felt it: the awareness of others, the silent watching, the unspoken questions. When the safety demonstration began, Maya closed her laptop and listened, using the distraction to steady herself. The cheerful voice of the lead flight attendant filled the cabin as she explained how to fasten seat belts and locate exits. For a brief moment, the tension eased. But just as the demonstration ended and the attendants began securing the cabin, the man leaned forward again, speaking just loudly enough for her to hear. "Look," he said softly, "I don't want to make this a big deal. But I paid extra for this route. I've been upgraded every time before. I just don't understand why I can't sit where I usually do." Maya turned her head slightly, keeping her tone kind but resolute. "I understand you're frustrated," she said gently. "But this seat isn't about upgrades or preferences. I booked it weeks ago for work purposes. It's an important day for me." Something in her calmness seemed to catch him off guard. He hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "All right," he murmured, leaning back again. Maya thought it was truly over this time. She reached for her notebook, writing down a few last-minute reminders for her meeting. But the quiet glances from nearby passengers continued. People seemed to sense that something unusual had unfolded, and it made the atmosphere feel heavier than it should have been for an ordinary morning flight. After a few more minutes, the cabin doors closed, and the engines roared to life. The plane slowly began to taxi toward the runway. Maya leaned back, inhaling deeply, letting the rhythmic vibrations beneath her feet soothe her nerves. She closed her eyes for a moment and thought about her parents back home in South Carolina. They had always believed in her dreams, even when they seemed too big to reach. Her mother used to say, Keep your head high, Maya. You belong in every room you step into. That thought comforted her now. The announcement came over the speakers, asking everyone to fasten their seat belts for takeoff. Maya buckled hers tightly and glanced out the window at the soft glow of the rising sun. But then, just as the plane lined up on the runway, she heard the same man's voice again, this time louder, speaking to a flight attendant who had returned to his row. "Can you at least check again?" he said, his tone edged with insistence. "There has to be a mistake. I don't see why I'm sitting back here when I always sit up front." The attendant remained professional, repeating gently what had been explained before. "Sir, I've checked twice already. Dr. Robinson's seat is confirmed as 2A. I understand your frustration, but we need you to remain seated so we can take off." A few more nearby passengers looked up now, their curiosity fully drawn to the interaction. One man shook his head softly, while another leaned slightly into the aisle to get a better view. Maya sat still, her gaze fixed on the tablet in her lap, determined not to be pulled into the moment again. But her calm exterior couldn't hide the subtle pressure she felt building in the air around her. The engines roared louder, but the mood in the cabin had changed. What had begun as a simple seating confusion was slowly becoming something more, not loud, not chaotic, but quietly heavy. Maya inhaled deeply and straightened her shoulders, reminding herself of one thing: she had every right to be here. She didn't know it yet, but the small ripples of tension inside the cabin were setting the stage for something much larger to unfold. This flight, meant to be an ordinary start to an important day, was about to become unforgettable. The plane rolled slowly toward the runway, and Maya thought they were finally moments away from takeoff. She leaned back into her seat, closing her eyes for a brief second, trying to calm her mind before the long day ahead. But just as the aircraft reached the edge of the taxiway, she heard raised voices behind her. It was the same man again. "Excuse me," he said firmly, his tone louder this time, "I need to speak to whoever's in charge. There has to be a mistake with my seat assignment." The flight attendant standing a few rows back tried to soothe him. "Sir, we've already checked the system multiple times. Your seat is 3C, and Dr. Robinson is confirmed for 2A. I understand you're disappointed, but we really need everyone seated so we can depart." But the man shook his head and gestured toward Maya's seat. "I always sit here on this route. Always. I don't see why I'm suddenly being pushed back today." Several passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. A soft ripple of murmurs moved through the cabin. Maya kept her gaze steady on her tablet, her hands resting calmly on the keyboard, though she could feel the weight of every glance around her. The lead flight attendant walked over, her tone calm but firm. "Sir," she said gently, "please take your assigned seat so we can continue taxiing. If we don't resolve this quickly, the captain will have to pause takeoff." Her words seemed to have the opposite effect. The man leaned back in his seat but didn't buckle his belt. He crossed his arms and muttered something under his breath. From the cockpit, the captain's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to hold on the runway for a few minutes. Thank you for your patience." The engines lowered to a soft hum, and the plane stopped moving. Passengers began exchanging glances, whispering quietly. Maya stayed perfectly still, focusing on her breathing, trying not to get pulled into the growing tension. Another attendant crouched beside the man's row, speaking softly, but he shook his head again. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "I was upgraded. This has to be fixed." Finally, the lead attendant turned to Maya. Her voice was warm and respectful, but Maya could see the concern in her eyes. "Dr. Robinson," she said softly, "I'm so sorry to bother you, but would you mind showing your boarding pass one more time so we can close this out completely?" Maya smiled politely and handed over her digital ticket. "Of course." The attendant scanned it once more, then nodded firmly. "Confirm 2A. There's no mistake." She turned back to the man and said kindly, "Sir, I've double-checked. Everything is correct. If you're unhappy with your seat, we can speak with the gate agent after we land. But right now, we need to prepare for takeoff." By now, the quiet tension in the cabin had grown thick enough to feel. People were whispering, leaning toward one another, trying to piece together what was happening. A few passengers gave Maya small, supportive nods, others simply avoided looking her way. The man finally exhaled sharply and leaned back in his seat, buckling his belt without another word. For a moment, Maya thought it was truly over. The engines roared again, and the plane began to move. Relief washed through the cabin. But just before they reached the runway, the man unbuckled his belt and stood up suddenly. "I need this fixed now," he said, his voice rising just enough for several rows to hear. The flight attendants reacted instantly. One stepped forward, holding up her hand. "Sir, please sit down immediately. We can't move the aircraft if you're standing." "I'm not sitting down until this is sorted," he replied, shaking his head. The attendant's expression tightened. "If you refuse to sit, the captain will have no choice but to return us to the gate." The man didn't answer, but he also didn't sit. That was enough. Moments later, the captain's voice returned, calm but unmistakably firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a passenger issue that needs to be resolved before we can continue. For everyone's safety, we're returning to the gate." A collective sigh moved through the cabin. Some passengers leaned back in frustration, others groaned quietly, and a few shook their heads. Maya remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her heart beat faster now. The plane slowly turned back toward the terminal. Outside the window, the runway lights blurred slightly as they retraced their path. Inside, the murmurs grew louder. Two people a few rows ahead whispered to each other, one saying softly, "All this, over a seat." Another sighed and muttered, "Now we'll be late." Maya kept her focus on her breathing, counting each inhale and exhale. She had done nothing wrong, yet she felt the subtle pressure of being at the center of something she hadn't asked for. When the plane stopped at the gate, two uniformed airport staff members entered the cabin. Their expressions were calm, their movements deliberate. One spoke softly to the man, explaining the situation again. "Sir, we need you to follow us off the aircraft so we can resolve this at the gate." He shook his head at first but, after a long pause, finally picked up his carry-on and stood. The silence inside the cabin was thick now, every passenger watching. As he walked past Maya's seat, he didn't make eye contact. She didn't move, didn't speak, simply kept her gaze on the tablet in her lap. When he stepped off the plane, the crew quietly thanked the airport staff and closed the door behind them. The lead attendant returned to the front, her voice steady as she addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We'll be underway as soon as possible. Thank you for your patience." The engine started up again, and a ripple of quiet relief moved through the cabin. Some passengers smiled reassuringly at Maya as if to say, "You handled that well." She returned a small, polite nod but said nothing. The plane eventually took off, climbing steadily into the pale blue sky. As the ground fell away beneath them, Maya finally allowed herself to breathe fully again. She glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift lazily below, and thought about everything that had just happened. What started as a small misunderstanding had grown into something much larger, something that had delayed an entire flight. But Maya hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't argued. She had stayed calm, steady, and composed through it all. And somehow, she knew deep down that this moment was bigger than just her seat. She didn't realize it yet, but what had happened on that plane was about to follow her far beyond the runway. By the time the plane finally touched down at New York's LaGuardia Airport, the city skyline glimmered in the distance beneath soft morning light. Maya closed her laptop and slipped it into her bag, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The 3-hour flight had felt much longer than usual. As passengers gathered their belongings, Maya noticed a quiet energy around her. Several people gave her polite, knowing smiles as they passed. One woman paused briefly at her seat, placing a gentle hand on the armrest. "You handled everything so calmly," she said softly. "I just wanted to say I admired that." Maya returned a warm smile. "Thank you," she said simply. The woman nodded and moved toward the aisle, leaving Maya with a sense of quiet gratitude. She had tried her best to remain composed during the entire ordeal, not because it was easy, but because losing her calm wouldn't have helped anyone. As she stepped off the plane, her phone vibrated in her hand. At first, she thought it might be a reminder for her upcoming investor meeting, but when she unlocked the screen, dozens of notifications appeared all at once. Mentions. Tags. Messages. She frowned slightly, confused, until she clicked on one notification. It was a short video, shaky, filmed from inside the plane. The clip showed the moment the flight attendants spoke to the man and eventually asked him to leave the aircraft. The caption read, "She kept her calm the whole time. Grace under pressure." Hashtag flying with dignity. Maya's heart skipped a beat. She scrolled down and saw hundreds of comments pouring in beneath the video. Some praised her composure, others questioned why the situation had escalated the way it did. Within minutes, she realized the video had already been shared thousands of times. By the time she reached the terminal, her name was trending on social media. She paused near a quiet corner, taking a deep breath as she tried to process what was happening. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. Somehow, the incident had struck a chord with people everywhere. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts, an incoming call from her assistant, Rachel. "Maya, are you seeing this?" Rachel's voice was breathless with disbelief. "The video is everywhere. People are talking about how calm and professional you were. It's going viral." Maya rubbed her forehead gently. "I've seen it," she said softly. "I wasn't expecting this." Rachel hesitated before adding, "There are already journalists reaching out for comments. And the airline just released a statement apologizing for the confusion." Maya blinked in surprise. "They did?" "Yes," Rachel confirmed. "They've said they're reviewing their boarding procedures and retraining staff to handle situations more carefully. They even mentioned you by name, thanking you for your patience." Maya didn't know what to say at first. She wasn't angry at the airline, but she also knew how much this experience had affected her. She had tried to stay composed, but inside, she had felt the quiet pressure of proving she belonged where she was, not just in that seat, but in every space she stepped into. By the time she arrived at the hotel where her investor meeting was scheduled, reporters had begun sharing her story. Headlines ranged from, "Tech CEO shows unshakable grace during flight dispute," to "Passengers' calm demeanor sparks conversation on travel etiquette." It wasn't just news sites, though. On social media, hashtags began trending, hashtag stand with Maya, hashtag flying with dignity, hashtag grace under pressure. Messages poured in from people she had never met, college students, young professionals, seasoned executives, all sharing how her calmness had inspired them. Some told her about moments when they, too, had felt out of place in spaces where they'd worked hard to be. Others simply thanked her for showing what patience and dignity could look like under pressure. Later that evening, Maya sat in her hotel room, scrolling through the messages. One stood out to her, a note from a young woman in California: "I'm the only woman in my engineering team, and sometimes I feel like I have to prove I deserve to be there every single day. Watching how you stayed calm reminded me that we don't have to fight loudly to stand our ground. Thank you." Maya read the message twice, her throat tightening with emotion. She realized this was bigger than just a delayed flight. The video, the reactions, the conversations, they weren't just about her. They were about the quiet challenges so many people faced, often invisible to others, and the strength it took to remain composed when you felt you were being tested. The next morning, her investor meeting went better than she could have imagined. She delivered her pitch with clarity and confidence, and the investors were impressed not just by her company's vision, but by the way she carried herself. One of them even mentioned seeing the story online. "You have a rare ability to stay composed," one investor said. "That says a lot about you as a leader." Maya smiled politely, though inside she felt humbled. She hadn't planned any of this. She had simply chosen patience over anger, calmness over chaos, and somehow, that had resonated far beyond the walls of the plane. By the end of the week, Maya received an invitation to speak at a leadership conference. The topic they wanted her to address was resilience, but Maya knew it was about something deeper: presence, dignity, and strength in challenging moments. Standing on the stage weeks later, she faced a large audience filled with students, professionals, and leaders from all over the country. She told them her story, not as a viral headline, but as a quiet reminder: sometimes, the biggest statement you can make is by staying calm when everything around you feels unsteady, she said. Your worth isn't measured by how loudly you demand it, it's shown by how steadily you carry it. The audience rose to their feet, the applause echoing through the hall. Maya smiled softly as she left the stage, knowing that what began as a stressful flight had turned into something much greater: a reminder, for herself and countless others, that dignity and grace are powerful forms of strength. And though she hadn't chosen the spotlight, she embraced the chance to use her voice, not just as a CEO but as someone who understood what it meant to belong.